Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the first of 3 webinars in the GCOOS Marine Heatwave series. My name is Krista Manello. I'm the Outreach and Education Manager for GCOOS. I've had the pleasure of co-organizing this series with my fabulous colleague, Ren Kamakura, who came to GCOOS as a National Academy Science Policy Fellow. Really, since day one, Ren has been a tremendous asset to GCOOS. She's been working with our colleagues, Dr. Brian Gies-Wankowski, Zhao Qi, Deb Rao, to better understand marine heat waves and their impacts on the Gulf region. The first 2 webinars in this series focus on the impacts of marine heat waves on marine species. The third webinar in the series considers marine heat waves and coastal weather. We hope the presentations make you aware of ongoing work in this space and promote dialogue on how the ability to forecast these events can aid resource management, resilience, and public health. The webinar format will be 10-minute presentations, followed by time for questions. For questions, please type your questions in the box or raise your hand so that we can unmute you. You should see an icon with a small question mark on your screen, just like you would use for a chat box. It's the same feature. So Ren, without any further ado, I would like to hand it off to you to introduce our speakers today.
Absolutely. Hey, everybody. Really excited to have all of you joining us today. One last minor housekeeping note that I'll throw out there is that this is being recorded, so just be aware of that as we go forward. I will do just a brief plug about some of the work we've been doing at GCOOS related to marine heat waves before we go into talking about our wonderful speakers who will be joining us today. So just to give a little bit of context, right, a lot of my job at GCOOS has been to focus on marine heat waves and their impacts on species, ecosystems, and industries in the region. And what we did was looking at scientific literature, government reports, and anything else we could find to figure out what was going on in our region. And we definitely found a lot of gaps in the information that we know, but there is a lot that we did see, especially some pretty negative impacts for some of our species like corals, seagrasses, and oysters, and then others that are slightly more indirect, but still can impact species like our seabirds and our marine mammals. And those impacts can then cascade to impact our fisheries and other industries in the region. So on top of all of that, unfortunately for us, marine heat waves can also impact coastal weather, right? Like our hurricanes in particular that are of major concern. And so this webinar series really is an opportunity for us to bring together some experts, see how marine heat waves are intersecting with the great work that they already do, so we can see how much are they already learning, what are we knowing for our region, where are the gaps that we need to continue to kind of understand, and what can we do going forward. So hopefully all of you bring some of the great expertise and knowledge that you have into the chat, bringing your own experiences and questions so we can kind of all grow and learn together as we get into this brave new world here. Today, I'm really excited to have a bunch of folks who especially work on data related questions, whether it's collecting data or sharing those data more broadly as it relates to marine species in the Gulf region. And since data is really kind of an important backdrop for us to be able to do anything else, including respond to species declines in general and heat waves in particular, really excited to have those folks kind of kicking us off in this webinar series. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our 3 panelists before we get started into their short presentations. So first, we have Lizzie Harris, who is the Creel Program Lead at Texas Parks and Wildlife Division. She got her Bachelor's of Science in Biology with a marine and organismal concentration from Spring Hill College in Mobile, Alabama. Got a Master's in Oceanography and Coastal Sciences from Louisiana State University with a focus on recent wetland elevation dynamics in central Louisiana. And then was a 2023 Science Policy Fellow based at Texas Parks and Wildlife Coastal Fisheries, and luckily liked it enough to stick around, which is wonderful. Really excited to have you here with us today, Lizzie. Another panelist that we have is Megan Howson, who is the marine mammal biologist and data scientist at GCOOS for the Cetacean and Sea Turtle Atlas projects. We'll hear a little bit more about in the presentations that they're going to give. Megan has dual bachelor's degrees in marine science and biology from the University of Miami's Rosenthal School of Marine and Atmospheric Science, with minors in chemistry and psychology. Racking them up here. Also has a master's degree in marine biology from Texas A&M University Galveston, and her master's project focused on identifying cultural patterns in behavior and acoustics across several cetacean species. So excited to have Megan joining us today. And our last panelist will be Jerad King, who is the GCOOS GIS manager. Jerad is responsible for the administration and development of the GCOOS GIS network, home to a number of GCOOS projects, including Cetacean, Sea Turtle Atlas, and Gandalf, for those of you who like poking around some of our glider data sets. He got his master's degree in geography from Texas A&M in College Station, and unfortunately, will be transitioning to a new role at the intersection of GIS and oceanography. So we're really excited that Jerad decided to join us for this webinar series before he goes. So with that, we have an absolutely incredible group of folks who will be sharing their knowledge and information with us today. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and kick it off to Lizzie Harris to start us off.
Hey y'all, thanks so much for the introduction, Ren. I'm Lizzie. I work with the career program at Texas Parks and Wildlife. Also, if I randomly disappear, I'm so sorry, but for some extremely weird reason, I think my computer's dying and won't charge in any fashion, no matter where I plug it in. So, but we'll just roll with that. So, as I said, I work with Texas Parks and Wildlife. I work out of Rockport, Texas, and I've been working with the career program for about 10 months or so. And this disappeared, hold on. Let's see, slideshow from beginning. Okay. So what does TPWD's Coastal Fisheries Division do? A wide variety of things from recreational to commercial harvest aspects. Hold on, sorry, it keeps disappearing on my screen. Okay, here we go. What does TPWD's Coastal Fisheries Division do? We examine the intersection between commercial and recreational fisheries with respect to how people utilize and interact with resources. By resources, we mean various fisheries. So we oversee commercial fisheries such as crabbing, shrimping, and oystering, as well as other fisheries. And then we also bridge the gap between recreational and commercial fisheries. And then what I do is I work with harvest limits. So we're talking about bag and slot limits. So how large fish can be and how many fish you can essentially legally retain as a recreational angler. And then we also conduct biological resource sampling, including TOS, which just stands for targeted oyster sampling, and a lot of different ones that I'll kind of describe what sorts of environmental variables we also collect data for. Okay, recreational resource data. So this is a picture of me surrounded by a ridiculous amount of brown algae. Oh, actually, no, it might be red algae in the lower Laguna Madre from some of our bay trawl samples where we look at zooplankton. We also do it in the Gulf as well, and this gives us an idea of species abundances and what species are really out there. And we do this in all of the coastal bay systems of Texas, from Sabine Lake all the way down through the lower Laguna Madre. And we look at biological catch-related sampling, which includes both biotic and abiotic factors. So some of our sampling that we do involves bottom long lines, which will catch different fish via long line. We'll also look at bathymetry and do sonar related projects. We do that with our habitat assessment team. And then we also look at salinity, turbidity. We do seine nets along the shorelines, and then we also do those trawls in the bays and in the Gulf as well. For recreational harvest data, this is what I do. And this is a picture of one of our boat ramps. So we essentially examine how recreational anglers interact with our resources. And we do this predominantly through our career program. Our career program involves conducting interviews with recreational anglers at both private and public boat ramps across the Texas coast. We have about 250 or so boat ramps that we survey, and this is all across the Texas coast. We do about 1,000 survey days a year or so, and this gives us insight into how recreational anglers are actually interacting with different fisheries. So what species are the most sought, how satisfied people are with their trips, meaning like how many fish they caught. We ask them questions about where they went fishing, demographics about where our anglers are from, questions like that. And this gives us key insight into estimating both the effort and also the landings. And what we do with that data is it involves some regional collaboration as well, but we also interact with the National Marine Fisheries Service, and we provide different estimates of our data and some of our really important fisheries such as red snapper and that sort of modeling as well. So how does TPWD incorporate environmental conditions into our work? We do this in a variety of ways, but I'm just going to describe some of the ways we utilize it with our recreational program. So for our harvest surveys, those creel surveys, we have a record. Our creel survey started back in 1973, and we have a series, we've been updating it, but we have a series essentially of every hurricane or tropical storm event that has resulted in a creel survey cancellation somewhere on the Texas coast since 1973. which is very interesting because it gives us insight into what local areas have been impacted by those types of storms. We also collect wind and temperature data at the start and at the end of every creel survey. So a little bit less on the environmental data for the harvest. We do that more with our resource sampling, which we do monthly in all of our coastal areas. We measure things such as sea surface temperature, salinity, turbidity, other aspects of water quality monitoring. And we also look at wind speed and wind direction at the beginning of those survey days and ambient temperature as well. And we look at the different assemblages of fish and invertebrate diversity that we see out there. So this is a really primitive example of a graph of some of our creel survey data. So this is just looking at starting wind speed from all of the creels we've conducted on the Texas coast between January 2025 and March of 2025. Each of these individual little blips represents a creel survey, and this represents the starting wind speed. So one example of how we look at this data is I'm responsible in our QCing process for looking and seeing if there's any sort of outliers for their QC data. So for example, you might see a survey that has a crazy high starting wind speed. That's usually a typo, or that tells us to go into the system and think, okay, what happened there? Was this a particularly windy day? Did that result in a cancellation of this survey? What exactly does that mean? And we'll also do plots of, our starting temperatures and things like that to kind of get seasonal variation and trends. And it tells us actually some insight into how angler behavior shifts. So for example, in a study that we were conducting about angler satisfaction, which is basically a question of, on a scale of 0 to 10, how satisfied is an angler with their trip that day? And they give you a number. Lower trip satisfaction is correlated with temperatures over 30 degrees Celsius, which makes sense because that's extremely hot. So in regards to marine heat wave and climate impacts, I wanted to start with, some obvious climatic impacts to Texas. Unfortunately, anybody that has lived on the Texas coast or near the Texas coast is very familiar with the destruction from Hurricane Harvey in 2017, which caused a lot of significant wind damage in the city where I work, which is Rockport, Texas. So I included a picture of that just as a visual. And as we know, marine heat waves and higher sea surface temperatures influence a lot of climate-related factors, such as, the potential for increased severity of tropical storm events, but also what is interesting, can affect climate in a way that can prolong drought persistence, because there's certain areas of the Texas coast. Interestingly, up towards Houston, there's a lot more precipitation in their climate. Whereas if you go further south towards where I live in Corpus Christi, and there's always a persistent drought down here on the coast because we just get a lot less rain as well. So it can kind of exacerbate those factors as well. And then how exactly do marine heat waves impact fisheries? It's a pretty varied response, but I'm going to talk about a few of those. One of the main ways is probably going to be related to fish kills. So essentially higher sea surface temperatures are related to fish kill events. Fish kill events are exactly what they sound like. It's something that causes a massive die-off of a particular species, or in a lot of cases, multiple species of fish. And we have our response team in our division that is ironically called the Kills and Spills team, that deals with oil spills and also categorizing how many fish have died from environmental impacts, but also from weather-related things as well. So this also has the potential, unfortunately, with higher sea surface temperatures related to fish kills. A lot of that has to do with, higher sea surface temperatures leading to hypoxic events and leading to more fish kills. There's also the potential for it to affect fish migration and spawning. There's also, with fish kills particularly, there are actually some species that are more vulnerable than other species. So, for example, one of the fish that is most often sought by recreational anglers in coastal Texas is speckled trout. And with respect to speckled trout, in 2021, in February, there was a major freeze event that killed over 160,000 spotted sea trout. That's an underestimate, but that's our best estimate in the lower Laguna Madre. And so because of that, some fish are more vulnerable than others. So spotted sea trout was mainly the species that completely died out during that event. And this actually impacts how our anglers are going to interact with the resource. So for example, whenever we have major fish kill events due to higher sea surface temperatures and things like that, or cold stunning events, which happen unfortunately like in Winter Storm Uri, it impacts how we set our recreational harvest limits. So slot length, meaning we do every fishery, for slot length, a fish has to reach the maturation, except for red drum because they live longer. But with slot length, for example, after Winter Storm Uri, we decreased the slot length of what fish could be retained, and we also decreased the bag limit, so the amount of fish that could be retained by recreational anglers as a result of those winter storm events that killed a bunch of spotted sea trout. Additionally, we also see a difference in how anglers shift their behavior in regards to changes in a fishery. So for example, if we use Winter Storm Uri as an example, all those anglers that were going out and traditionally targeting speckled trout or sea trout, from our initial data analysis actually shows that a lot of those anglers switched and began targeting species like red drum or black drum more often. We also noticed too that whenever there's particular die-offs on certain regions of the coast, so for example in 2023 there was a major die-off of menhaden up around Freeport area, we noticed that anglers shift where they're fishing as well. So even using Winter Storm Uri as an example on the Texas coast, it predominantly affected the very lower coast region, so the lower Laguna Madre. So we actually started seeing fishermen that were in that area in some of our Creole interviews traveling further north to still be able to target speckled trout. So those are some potential impacts with marine heat waves. Really affects the migration and spawning of fish, but the main issue is with major fish kill events that will affect recreational slot and bag limits and also affect where anglers are targeting fish and essentially what species they're targeting. So that's pretty much all for me, and thank you. I'll take any questions now.
That was awesome. Thank you so much, Lizzie. That was super informative. Just to remind folks, you can drop your questions in the questions pane. There will be time for more questions in our kind of panel discussion zone. But I'll kick us off with one question, I guess, that I'm thinking about. You mentioned that anglers are shifting their fishing behavior, obviously, by where the fish are, and you see these changes with major environmental events. When you're talking to anglers, do they talk about why they're moving? Is it primarily just because the fish are moving? Are they thinking like, oh, we've noticed an environmental condition? Or yeah, what do you hear from folks?
Actually both. So whenever we go to set different recreational harvest limits, so slot length and bag limit, we do what we call public scoping meetings. So I'll use Winter Storm Uri as an example. When Winter Storm Uri hit, we were able to put in emergency regulations. Basically, that means we don't have to go through the full legislative process of public scoping meetings, then public hearings, public comments, and then bringing that to our legislative body, the Texas Parks and Wildlife Commission, who makes those decisions for that slot length and bag limit. And so we put in immediately emergency regulations that took down the slot length and the bag limit. But what we noticed whenever those emergency regulations ended about 6 months after, the initial fish kill, in different public scoping, it's what we call those meetings when we're going out and we're in different fishing communities in coastal Texas, we're asking recreational anglers. Some of this we're gathering from those interviews at docks, asking this one particular question where we go, hey, what particular species were you, hoping to land today? Like what species were you targeting today? And we noticed a shift in what the anglers were saying. I definitely noticed there was an increase in how many people were going for a red drum specifically instead of speckled trout, although a lot of people already go for red drum anyway. But we get it from that, and then also from the public scoping meetings where all we're trying to do is ask people questions like, hey, how do you feel like the fishery is being managed? Do you feel like you're seeing the populations of these fish coming back? And a lot of people were still reporting, yes, you can land some speckled trout, but you're not landing as many as we used to. And more importantly, a lot of those fish were not in a large enough size class, meaning that those fish were much younger. So we ended up doing a bunch of modeling after our public scoping meetings, and then kind of people wanted to see increased, wanted to still see those restrictions on the fishery in terms of restricted bag limit and slot length. And we modeled that it'll take about 7 years for that full population to rebound after Winter Storm Uri.
Dang, yeah, wow, that is quite a long time to wait for the population to recover, but it makes sense. Anglers are noticing things, and then you can kind of do the modeling to respond to the questions and needs that they bring up. That's awesome. I see there's a question in the chat, in the question box. That's awesome. I am going to move us to the next presenters to make sure we have time for the panel discussion, but we will come back to your question when we get to the end. So thank you so much. All right, thank you so much, Lizzie. Really appreciate it. Next, we will be kicking it over to Megan Howson to start us off for the presentation, joint presentation with Megan and Jerad. So you should have controls. Over to you.
Is my screen showing? Ren?
That was good.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I work primarily with cetaceans and sea turtles. And so one of our main projects was to build the cetacean, which is the compilation of environmental threat and animal data for cetacean population health analysis data portal. It's quite a name. And this came after the Deepwater Horizon. We were trying to track where our cetacean populations are, what other threats are they facing, and how we can best interact with that. So we needed to quantify the cumulative impact of stressors on cetacean populations. And one of the big problems with that is the data is in 15 million different places. And for a lot of these incidents, like marine heat waves, managers need to access that data pretty immediately to be able to make effective management decisions. Sea Turtle Atlas has a really similar design and setup and pretty similar goals. We were able to refine the questions a little bit better for Sea Turtle Atlas. So we're looking at leatherback habitat use, some understanding of loggerhead green and Kemp's Ridley movement, particularly in Louisiana, as well as where there's an overlap of nesting and mating habitat, since these are areas that are really important to protect these species and ensure that we're managing the populations correctly and any stressors that they face. As we were designing these two data portals, we wanted to make sure that they were really easy for people to access. These data sets can come in a multitude of different formats. We have tabular data, CSV files, some video data, as well as geospatial data. And so everything is hosted within an ArcGIS hub system. We also wanted to make sure it was easy for end users to search the data. So we organized it in a couple different ways. Different people approach data sets from different mindsets. So you can either find it by category. So if you know you're looking for population data or threat data, it's sorted that way. If you know you're looking for a particular species, we have it organized by species, as well as certain collections are highlighted. For example, for cetaceans in US waters, one of the biggest surveys is the GOMAP surveys, so we highlight a collection of the GOMAP survey data. Everything is also tagged, so you can search it by species programmatically, which just makes it a little bit easier for people who are filing it into a specific workflow. And again, everything it was designed with the mindset of accessibility. We want to make this data access as easy as possible. So for some of these data sets, they can be very large. They can have up to over 20 different species, and then a user might only be interested in one, so you can filter out the species. You can also filter out how you're viewing the data if you're more interested in group size. All of those tools exist within the data portal. And it allows you to download the data in any way you want to interact with it, as a CSV file, shapefile, GeoJSON, file geodatabase. All of that is available. And so after a brief overview of these two different portals, the reason why we put so much time and effort into organizing the data portals this way is we wanted to make sure that managers had really easy access, as the public as well, so that when you're facing an issue such as a marine heat wave, they're able to get access to the data and manipulate the data as quickly as possible. So for marine heat waves and their impact on marine mammals and sea turtles, it's pretty indirect. These are highly mobile species. They're able to move out of the area when the temperatures are too high, unlike species such as corals, which are stuck there. And so then you see a pretty immediate impact like bleaching. So instead, what we're looking at is some secondary impacts. They have a higher energy expenditure. This can be because they're in warmer waters, and that's going to increase their metabolism. They also have to move out of their normal range, whether that is to find food or because they're trying to move to cooler waters. It can impact their prey availability. If their food source is not available due to marine heat wave, that's going to have an impact. We see it specifically with nesting for sea turtles. It can either be when they are nesting, it does impact their nesting habits, as well as after they've laid the nest. If there is a heat wave, it can actually impact the ratio of males to females within the eggs themselves, which have pretty long-lasting impacts on the overall population. One of the other secondary impacts of heat waves is we tend to have these harmful algal blooms, which impact the species. Dolphins tend to develop some respiratory problems, just like we do. And then major storms like hurricanes that we see after heat waves, this impacts where the animals can be found. They have to move out of the area if there's a storm, and this can also have a longer term impact where resident populations that have been within one region for decades are now forced to relocate to a new area. So when we know we have all these impacts, we wanted to make sure that there was a way for users to kind of look into how these impacts are affecting certain populations. So for prey distribution, we are able to link directly with the NOAA DisMap tool. This is showing the distribution of multiple different prey species, including where they're found at average depths. So the surface water tends to get warmer faster. So these species over time, as the waters are getting warmer and we're seeing more and more marine heat waves, they're moving into deeper waters. And this is then our species such as cetaceans are having to move into deeper waters and hunt in deeper waters to find their prey, which has a higher energy expenditure for them. For sea turtles, we're able to link to different state nesting data. So this is showing the Florida sea turtle nesting beach monitoring program, the density of different nests at different regions. And you would be able to look at this and look at where there's a marine heat wave, overlap it with environmental data and see could this be impacting where there's nesting, the timing of nesting, and if the heat wave is occurring after nests have already been laid, is there then the potential for this to impact different sex ratios within the nest? Marine heat waves can be really within a really short period of time as well as longer, but you need that real-time information about where they are occurring. And we wanted to link to these data sets that do provide that near real-time information. So we do have point observations where you can link directly to a sensor, get that instantaneous information, particularly for sea surface temperature. We have multiple different layers for those. And then we also include data about where some of these secondary impacts may be occurring. We'll overlay where there are any current storms, as well as historical tracks for storms, as well as where there are any harmful algal blooms. Then I'll pass it over to Jerad to talk a little bit more about how we linked in adding this environmental data.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Megan. So one of the key challenges that we faced with provisioning large marine mammal data sets was actually a lack of data or an absence of observation data. We faced the diametrically opposite issue with the case of environmental data, and that we had all these satellite products, these wonderful satellite data products that provided a full 15-year timescale of what the environmental conditions were in the Gulf region since the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. So this provides us with a complete time series of environmental observations over our study period. However, we found that this amount of data actually posed some technical issues for our platform, and we had a lack of compatibility to deliver the experience that we wanted to deliver with the cetacean portal. So in conjunction with some storage challenges, as well as the desire to ensure that environmental data can provide the same insights as our population and threat data, we had to upgrade our system a little bit and bring in some additional tooling to lift this satellite data off of one server and bring it onto ours. And that helps us meet user requirements, which allow individuals to access our data in a variety of different formats, as well as ensure that it's interoperable with other platforms. If you wouldn't mind, next slide.
Hang on.
The next slide.
Yeah, it's not moving.
Uh-oh.
I can make Jerad the presenter if easier.
Yeah,
Yeah, we could go ahead and switch over.
Great, got you.
Perfect. See, do you see it? Ooh.
yes.
Awesome. All right. So this is where we are sourcing our data from. This is the Coast Watch AirDAP, and this contains a multitude of different satellite data products that help us bring that information regarding key environmental indicators that impact the species we're studying with the Sea Turtle Atlas and cetacean projects. So what does the environmental data actually look like on cetacean? We're going to go through a couple of screenshots and actually do a quick demonstration to talk about some of the interactable features that are available with these new data sets. So on the left, what you're seeing is a view of, say, you found the data set and just clicked it. This is more of a coarse preview of the data set. It's probably not going to be symbolized in the exact way that you might want or include the exact region that you might want to study, but that's okay because you can change all of those things prior to provisioning the data for yourself. And on the right, we see additional info regarding that particular data set. So you can bring that data on the platform into Map Viewer. And I'd like to note there's no licensing required for any of this. This is all available, irrespective if you have like an ArcGIS account or not. But you can say, for example, select a particular time dimension within that data set or change the classification properties. So I'd like to demonstrate that now on the cetacean data portal, which you can access at cetacean.gcoos.org. So going down, we saw this view in the screenshots of the website, but now we can actually select environmental data. And now we see we have 36 data sets of our 439. This kind of indicates we're just starting, we're bringing in this data and it's being uploaded programmatically. So we're doing it years at a time. But for instance, let's take this first data set. This is a chlorophyll data set from the Modus platform. And here is our coarse view of the data, which gives us an idea about the coverage and extent of the data set over our time period. Then we can select more info over here by clicking this eye icon and get additional information about the data set. From there, we can click on View Details, and then we have access to the additional resources that are available with this data set. So we can also do something like this, where we can query the entire data portal for other data sets contained within this study area, or rather the geographic extent of the data set you selected. So there's a lot available for you to find data that may marry well for a given study. But to show some of the features that are available further that may be of use, we can go here to create a map and select our GIS map viewer. And now we're afforded more control over the data set. For example, we can go in the right-hand side pane here and select styles, style options, and adjust the stretch type. So what algorithm is used to build that scale. We can select standard deviation. And now we're seeing something that may be more appropriate for visualizing the chlorophyll A concentration. And then we can go through the time series here with the satellite orbit, there are gaps in the daily products. However, we're going to add the Terra satellite to ensure that there are complete temporal coverages for each of these key environmental indicators. So let's actually select a color ramp, a single color ramp, and include an additional data set with this layer. So in the layer menu to the left here, we can actually search ArcGIS Online or our groups for the additional data sets that are contained within either Cetacean or Sea Turtle Atlas. So here, let's find one that's June 2021, and we can bring in our sea surface temperature anomaly. So let's go ahead and bring that layer in and go back to our layer view. All right, we're here. So now we can adjust, once again, that stretch type and color scheme. I'm satisfied with this color scheme, but we're going to change the stretch type. And now we can see these two environmental data sets from two different platforms interacting with each other over a time scale. And then we can incorporate biological data into this as well and have a really rich picture of what's going on in the Gulf in conjunction with the vessel observations, the species distribution models, and a whole host of other biological and anthropogenic data sets that are relevant to the study of large marine mammals and sea turtles in the Gulf. So with that, I will show where you can access all these resources, including the program that was used to create those data sets on ArcGIS, which is ERDAPT ArcGIS Online, accessible at this link. And with that, I guess we will close out my time and take questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Jerad and Megan. Now we're going to go into kind of the open panel discussion and questions. I know we've already got some questions in the chat, but I invite all of our speakers to come back on if you're comfortable being on camera, just so everyone can kind of pose questions to you, which is great. I also going to have a transparent facilitator moment. Attendees, I'm going to try to allow you to unmute if you would like to ask your question that way, but we'll see how well it works. So I also see some of the questions in the chat, and I can just read those out if needed. Okay, I will go ahead and read the question just in case, but if anyone else wants to unmute at any point, feel free to do so, and we can try to make sure that you're able to ask your question, but you can also drop them in the chat. Okay, great, Lizzie's in at least, okay, so it's on the phone, all right. Okay, so we can have you hop in. Can you do audio, Lizzie, to answer questions?
Yay, I can.
Perfect, okay, not on video, but Lizzie is here in the ether, perfect. Okay, awesome. So I'm going to give a question that Glenn dropped in the chat, which is, how deep does a hypoxic surface layer become before you notice significant fish kill events?
Honestly, that's a great question. I don't know the depth necessarily off the top of my head. I just know of it more as like an area-wide thing, if that makes sense. Because whenever we're seeing, you know, observations of fish kills, we're usually not seeing them until they wash up on the shore, if that makes sense. So I don't have a great working knowledge of the actual depth with which the hypoxic zone goes.
That makes sense, yeah. Thank you, Lizzie.
Although I wish I did. I might have to look into that.
Yeah, something to look into next. Yeah, great question, Glenn. Thank you for that. All right, let me see. Emma, I saw a question from you. I think I might allow you to unmute. If you want, you can try to say your question out loud, and if not, I'm happy to read it from the chat. All right, then I will just read it from the chat. Okay, so great presentation, Elizabeth. Curious if anglers you've spoken to have described interactions increased or decreased with sea turtles during marine heat wave events.
Ooh, that's a good question. Not as much that I know of. We haven't really had a lot of encounters with marine heat waves in terms of like higher sea surface temperature. But we have noticed more like cold stun sorts of events. And usually when it comes to the cold stun events, our kills and spills team, also in conjunction with the Texas Marine Mammal Stranding Network, are usually the ones that, and some of our field personnel as well in our division, are the ones going out and, helping to rehabilitate the sea turtles that are stunned. Okay, let's try that. So as far as I know, no, I haven't really heard a lot of mention of anglers that are directly seeing sea turtles that are impacted from marine heat waves. But also, I think part of that also has to do with the fact that our recreational anglers, most of them are staying in shore waters. Most of them are staying in bay waters, which you're going to usually see more sea turtles in the Gulf typically, a little bit further offshore. So that might be part of it as well.
Yeah, not necessarily in a spot where they're going to run into sea turtles most of the time. Makes sense. Thank you. Appreciate it. Feel free to keep dropping your questions in the chat if you have any. I have a question actually for Megan and or Jerad here. I guess I'm curious, when we're thinking of the creation of Cetacean and Sea Turtle Atlas, were there specific species that y'all were really keeping an eye on or were really of concern as those were kind of getting going, or at least that you've heard in the conversations you've had as you've developed these tools? I cannot hear you at the moment.
I would prefer the marine mammal biologist takes this question.
Megan, can you speak at all, or is
Okay,
it's fighting you?
Okay. If you click it enough times, it'll eventually work. So for cetacean, we were given a couple specific species to start out with and a couple species groups. So Sinella as a group, which are your spotted dolphins, spinner dolphins, bottlenose, Rice's whale, which is endemic to the Gulf, and we think less than 100 individuals. So that's definitely a population that we're tracking really, really closely, at least best that we can. They're very data limited. Sperm whales, and then beaked whales as a group. For marine heat waves specifically, the populations that we have the most data on at least are bottlenose, just because they are more of a coastal species. They're easier to collect data on. So we do know that they have issues, respiratory issues coming out after harmful algal blooms. It's likely Stenella do as well, since they're really similar behaviorally. We just don't have the data on it. And then we know across the board that some of these large storms that come after marine heat waves have a pretty large impact on them. For sea turtles, I mean, there's only 5 in the Gulf, so we're just covering all 5.
That makes it, yeah, all of the ones. I know Kemp Ridley is one of the ones that has come up a lot as of conservation concern, though I think it's doing a lot better. But yes, there aren't a ton, so it's easier to catch all of those. Great.
Yeah.
Another question I guess I have that honestly works for all of y'all is, I guess, yeah, what are the data gaps that y'all have noticed? I know there are a lot of them in the marine space. And what are some of the things that you're seeing that are maybe starting to fill some of those gaps, whether it's in the recreational angler space or in, as you're working kind of building Cetacean and Sea Turtle Atlas, some of the data gaps that you're seeing maybe being filled or that need to be filled in the future? I'll have maybe Lizzie start since you cannot see us, and then we'll go around.
That's a great question. Off the top of my head, what I'm thinking of is with respect to like recreational anglers, one challenge we have is how do we estimate fishing pressure? So how do we estimate how many people are actually going out and catching fish? And then how do we estimate landing? So how are we actually determining how many fish roughly are being caught? Because unfortunately, if it was a perfect world, you could go out and catch every fish in the world and say, this is exactly how many, red snapper you have, this is exactly how many red drum you have. And unfortunately, you can't do that. So a lot of it relies on, research with abundance and whatnot. And we're relying on the interviews that we intercept with recreational anglers. And part of the challenge we have within the Gulf region as a whole is that each state also has, a certain amount of their budget that they're able to allocate towards fisheries monitoring and things like that. So it's challenging because each state kind of has its own approach to estimating recreational catch, which can be challenging, but also really interesting because it's there's been a lot of conversations that facilitate talking about some key fishery species, and then also trying to figure out how we can better estimate things like discard mortality for reef species such as grouper, such as red snapper that are caught. Well, red snapper's caught Gulf-wide, grouper's more of the eastern Gulf anyway. But besides the point, the main thing is there's a lot of research being done, and we have a lot of conversations between different Gulf states and also at the national level with the National Marine Fisheries Service too, about how can we, yes, a lot of the data for different Gulf states is accessible within the same data space essentially, but how do we on a data level correlate different data and different, you know, time periods that people are out actually being able to conduct the sampling and whatnot? How do we correlate those things all together when they're all just different enough that it's hard to make those, you know, really heavy number and statistical comparisons? So that's definitely a conversation that I think is still developing and is a really interesting one, and something that I think will continue to develop in a really positive way in the future, because I think we're always learning, you know, trying to figure out balancing what's best for our anglers within our states, but also trying to learn from each other at a regional level and then at a federal management level as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example. I know one thing that's an extra challenge with marine heat waves is there's certainly some species that just have higher catch rates and during marine heat waves, which means that not only are you have the added challenge of like you're trying to compare what's happening in Texas, Louisiana, like every state is going to have their own thing, but then if it's hot and you're trying to monitor the population, you have to then try to adjust how you estimate the population based on catch if you're catching them more easily, which is just added headache onto your statistics, basically. Like we didn't need it to be any harder. Yeah.
Brent, I'm going to sneak in a question too, since I don't see any more in the chat.
Can we, real quick, I would love this, Chris. Do you mind if we give it a second for Megan and Jerad to answer the data question, and then I'll kick it over to you? Is that okay?
Absolutely.
I guess for data, it really depends. I mean, cetaceans and sea turtles are two completely different fields, even though people like to group them together. For data deficiencies with cetaceans, I think our two main problems are, one, a lot of these species are offshore, and that's really difficult to go out and study them. GOMAPS is wonderful for what it is. It's one of the only like consistent large scale monitoring projects that we have, but that's still limited to within the US EEZ. And then we're modeling everything in the Gulf based off of that. We are moving forward with acoustics a lot. That passive acoustic monitoring is allowing us to start to fill in a lot of these data gaps, particularly within the last year or so. Some of the ways that we can classify these detections and work through large data sets has really come a long way. So it's becoming a more viable way of monitoring these populations. And then the second problem is when it's a really small group, which tends to be more of a coastal problem, where you'll have a small regional group that has incredible data sets for one tiny geographic region. But these species don't necessarily respect those boundaries. And so then trying to connect these different groups. For example, there was a case after, and I can't remember which hurricane, but a major storm moved through an area and a population that had been well studied for decades disappeared. And they thought that the entire population had died. And then well over a year later, they actually found them in a different area. But because this one group wasn't monitoring that other area, they had no way of just realizing that they had migrated. So trying to put all the data in one place, that way we can connect these different groups and say, hey, the population that you normally study is actually over here now, and connect those two different research groups. For sea turtles, the fact that they're such a protected species is also problematic because the data is protected and people don't really want to share it. And there's a lot that, I mean, we're a public data repository, but it's not a good idea to broadcast to the public of, hey, there's a sea turtle nest right here in this exact location. People are going to go interact with it. So we put a lot of thought and care into trying to design the portals so that there is a lot of user selection and how they can contribute data and the protections that go along with it. But that's not something that's historically been done. So now we're in the place of trying to convince people that this is safe and it does work, and hosting all the data in one central repository is really our best option for then being able to go through and do these analytics and these statistics to get the best possible answers that we can.
Thanks so much. All right, over to you, Chris. I know you had a question you wanted to ask, please.
Yeah, thanks. Well, thanks to all three of our speakers. These have been really interesting. I learned so much every time I listen to our presenters on our webinars. The next logical step, I'm curious if you've given thought to, you've got this great resources, nobody's done this before, it's really valuable work, and you kind of alluded to it a second ago, Megan, that where do you envision doing trainings? How do you reach out to folks and let them know this product exists? Like, do you do, I know a plug for the National Marine Educators Association meeting is coming up. I know you're doing a session there, which is going to be great to get it exposure to the project and to the platform to new audiences. But for those decision-making managers and folks like that, have you thought about where and how you're going to launch the platform?
A little bit more for cetacean. We're kind of hitting that point right now. Cetacean's about a year or so further along than Sea Turtle Atlas. So when we started the project, we were given pretty specific project deliverables, and it was mostly to do with the Deepwater Horizon and those specific managers. But we do want to make this tool as useful to as broad a range of people as possible. So we now are starting to reach out to some of these other groups like the Marine Mammal Commission, IWC, each state's parks and wildlife, to see what they would need from us for this to be a useful tool. A lot of these states they cycle through, it's every 5 years roughly per species, and they go through and do a different species each year on assessing the population for that state. So we have all this data and all the different things that they would need to have to conduct that assessment. So how can we be a useful tool for them that this is now the kind of go-to option, and what they would need from us, both in terms of training, if there's any other data that they would need to be included. We're starting to have a lot of those conversations now.
Thanks. And that's sort of why I asked the question, because I want all of the participants on this webinar as well to realize it is work in development. And if there are specific questions and areas of data, environmental data, marine mammal data that are of concern to them and that they don't see it there, to reach out. And this is an evolving tool. And if they need training or any kind of special packaging of the information to be able to use it in a certain way, to certainly let us know.
Yes, we would love any and all of that feedback and data requests.
Yeah, shout out to the Texas Parks and Wildlife Division folks. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. Not to throw poor Lizzie under the bus. But yes, great plug. I think
You can definitely throw me under.
Great, get your expert feedback. That's perfect. I have maybe one last question, unless Chris, you had one that you wanted to throw out. But I guess my last question that I actually might direct towards Lizzie a little bit, but I very much would love to hear Megan and Jerad if you have any thoughts on this as well, is when we're thinking of marine heat waves, or really environmental event, you're like, or a cold snap, you really respond to the fish kills in that cold snap, that one kind of moment. At the same time, we also have longer term shifts, since our Gulf waters are getting hotter in some areas or others. And so I guess, how do we think about managing both the kind of acute, there's this one thing happening right now that we need to respond to, but also taking into account the longer term changes or kind of regional shifts in our ecosystems that we're trying to keep in mind. So like for Lizzie, for example, when y'all are thinking of managing your fisheries, how are you kind of balancing both like acute events, but also some of the longer term changes that y'all are seeing along the Texas coast?
Man, that's a great question. In terms of acute stressor events, kind of like we were talking about with the cold snaps, whenever you see a major fish kill, like the one after Winter Storm Uri, we're responding to those with the emergency regulations, and then we keep going back and forth after doing, public outreach and a period of public comment where we categorize those comments, and then we bring all of that information as well as the biological fisheries data we've been collecting on that fishery to show changes in the trends over time. And that really helps us to respond at kind of an acute level, and in some aspects, kind of a longer term scale as well. So for example, if we're using the speckled trout, the emergency regulations run for about 6 months, but we've had 2 or 3 different rounds of those public outreach, going through the data, that kind of thing, and then bringing forth different scenarios to the Texas Parks and Wildlife Commission, because those, I think, last as well about 6 months. So we're constantly kind of reevaluating how the population is doing. So, you know, as anglers are saying, hey, the population's rebounding, then hopefully we won't need to have as many harvest restrictions as well. And then for some of the really longer term stuff, we do actually notice a difference in the data as well. So for example, we do an internal presentation every year that we call the bioregs meeting, which is next month. It stands for bioregulations. And one interesting thing we've noticed over time since the 1983, which is a time period where a lot of our data has remained the same, we can go back and we can see that there is an increased amount of landings of red snapper, for example, but when it comes to us measuring the smaller ones that are recruiting back into the fisheries, we're seeing less of them. So the question is why, and kind of looking at that type of stuff. So when we have some of our personnel noticing those types of patterns, and then especially paying attention to some of like the premier recreational fisheries, so things like southern flounder, things like red drum and red snapper, and speckled trout on the coast, is kind of just stuff we're keeping an eye on anyway. So I would say that's kind of how we respond to longer term types of events. We're able to see when we pull any sort of data, which I feel like we do pretty frequently, to notice those trends and notice kind of what change is happening over time.
Awesome. I recognize it is 59, so we will perhaps pick Megan and Jared's brain later as well for some of these other questions. But I want to kick it over to Chris to close us out.
Thanks, everybody, so much. A quick thank you behind the scenes, our fabulous executive director, Jorge Brenner, and our associate director, Marcus Ogle, have been tremendously helpful in all of the logistics and the conversations leading up to these, and also to Nadine Slimak, our communications lead, for all of the packaging of the information and announcing all the webinars. We really appreciate you. Thanks to Elizabeth, Megan, and Jerad for all of your talks today. And for those who missed it or want to hear it again, we can refer them to the GCOOS YouTube. These will be available in the coming week. Please join us. Our next webinar in the series will be June 26th, and it's titled Marine Heatwaves and Oysters. And we'll be hearing from Andrea Tarnicki from the Auburn Shellfish Lab, Jeff Plumley from LSU and Louisiana Sea Grant, and from Blair Morrison from the Mobile Bay Estuary Program. Until then, thanks for joining us, and be well. See you soon.
Thank you, everybody.